5 women strung up like broken lanterns on a porch rail. That's what Elias Ward saw before he ever stepped foot on the land his uncle left behind. It was early spring in the Montana Territories, 1882. The kind of morning where the sun rose pale and slow, and the wind carried more than just the scent of pine and melting snow. It carried warnings. Elias had ridden for 3 days straight from Fort Lowell, hoping to find a quiet place to rebuild his life after war had hollowed out his soul. What he found instead was 5 bodies swinging in the morning breeze, their bare feet brushing against each other like wind chimes of death. Each woman was bound at the wrists and ankles, faces covered in grime, hair tangled and matted. The nooses dug deep into their necks, leaving angry red grooves like the hands of ghosts trying to pull them back. But what chilled Elias more than the bodies were the signs, burned into wood, nailed to each of their chests with cruel precision. This ain't your land. What belongs to Morrison stays Morrison. The name hit Elias like a hammer to the ribs. Morrison. A name that still echoed from the war fronts of New Mexico, a name tied to corruption and unspeakable trade, and now that name had followed him here, carved into the bark of his future. He dropped from the saddle in silence, boots crunching over frost and pine needles. A lantern of rising dread flickered in his gut. For a man who'd killed for far less, Elias Ward did something he'd never done before. He hesitated. For one long breath, he stood frozen beneath those 5 lifeless silhouettes until he saw one twitch. A toe. Just barely. But enough. He rushed forward, knife already in hand, slicing through the first rope. The woman collapsed into his arms, limp as death, but still breathing. Elias laid her gently on the ground, his fingers trembling. One by one, he cut the others down, catching each before their heads could hit stone. Their skin was ice cold, lips, blue wrists swollen from rope burns. But one after another they gasped, ragged, shuddering breaths like newborns clawing their way back into the world. This wasn't random. This wasn't justice. This was a message. He dragged them into the old cabin, his cabin now, and lit the fireplace with what little kindling he had. It was dark inside, but the flickering firelight revealed faces. Bruised, bloodied, but alive. Different ages, different stories, all bound together by the same nightmare. And Elias knew then, if he nursed them back to life, if he stood with them, he wasn't inheriting a cabin. He was stepping into someone else's war. The wind howled through the cracks in the wall like it too was trying to warn him. But Elias didn't turn back. He didn't ride off. He stayed. Sat by the fire, Winchester across his knees, listening to the silence of 5 women who should have been dead, and the storm that was coming for them all. Because out here in the West, justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears rope. This is just the beginning. The wind has only just begun to change. If you've read this far, thank you for riding with me into this story. Let me know where you're tuning in from tonight. It always warms my heart to know where these words find you. And if this tale already has you gripping your chair, trust me, you'll want to hear what happens when those women open their eyes. The fire popped and cracked in the old stone hearth, throwing light across skin gone pale from hanging too long between death and mercy. Elias sat cross-legged on the floor, his back to the door rifle within reach. His breath moved with the flames, steady but sharp, like a man trying to keep control of something breaking inside him. The 5 women lay in a rough semicircle around the fire, wrapped in old quilts and wool blankets Elias had found in a chest beneath the bed. Their breathing came shallow, uneven. The smoke clung to their skin and hair, hiding the bruises only slightly. But the light, flickering and alive, began to show more than pain. It showed identity. One by one, they opened their eyes. The first was the black-haired one. Her neck still bore the purple shadow of the noose. Her cheeks split and swelling. Yet her eyes, sharp green like pine needles wet with rain, stared at Elias like she could read every scar on his soul. She didn't speak at first, just watched, measured. She looked like someone who didn't ask for rescue, only vengeance. Then came the redhead. Her lips were cracked, but there was a kind of wild heat in her blue eyes, the kind a man might mistake for madness if he didn't recognize it for what it was, fury that had been denied a voice. She tried to sit up, cursed under her breath when her ribs ached. "Don't expect gratitude," she rasped, glaring at Elias. "You just made yourself a target." The blonde stirred next, slender, delicate, with hands that looked more used to baking than fighting. Her golden hair clung to her cheeks, tangled with blood and dirt. She clutched a faded scarf in her hands like a lifeline. Her voice trembled, soft but clear. "Are we safe now?" No one answered her. The fourth woman didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes, dark, almost black, said more than words could. She shifted slightly, dragging a small leather pouch closer to her chest. When Elias looked, he saw papers. Deeds, stamps, signatures. She watched him like a hawk, like she was calculating what kind of man he was before she placed any trust in him. Violet, he would learn her name was, the quiet one, and finally the oldest. Chestnut-haired skin, weathered but strong. She moved slowly but deliberately, checking the others, pressing cloth to wounds, offering a steadying hand. She'd been their spine while they were hanging, Elias realized, holding them up with will alone. Her voice was low, like smoke curling under a closed door. "My name's Grace, and I reckon you just lit a fire Morrison's been trying to put out for years." Elias didn't answer at first, just poured water into a battered tin cup and handed it to her. Grace sipped, then passed it to the redhead. No one fought her, not even the angry one. Around that fire, something unspoken passed between them, not warmth, not yet, but the recognition of shared survival. 5 women who weren't supposed to breathe another hour, and a man who wasn't supposed to care. But there they were, surrounded by frost and smoke, and something rawer than pain. Clarabelle, the black-haired woman, finally broke the silence. "You know who we are now, stranger?" Elias shook his head once. "Not yet." "You will," she said, "but it won't be pretty." She wasn't wrong, because behind every bruised face was a story of betrayal, of debt unpaid, of promises turned into shackles. Elias hadn't just saved them. He'd invited their ghosts inside. And ghosts don't stay quiet for long. If this part of the story already has you leaning in a little closer to the fire, then stick around. We haven't even begun to unravel what tied these women to that tree, or what kind of man it takes to stand beside them. Let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from? Montana, Texas? Or maybe just somewhere quiet with a warm cup in hand. Either way, you're part of this story now. Elias didn't sleep that night. He sat by the fire long after the women had drifted into uneasy rest, his hand on the hilt of the knife he'd used to cut them down. The blade sat across his lap like a confession, its edge still stained from frayed rope fibers and the blood it had scraped off their wrists. Outside, the wind howled like it was trying to tear the cabin apart plank by plank. But it was the silence inside that gnawed at him. Every crackle of the fire echoed louder than it should have. Every breath he took felt heavier than the last. Cutting those ropes had seemed like the only choice in the moment. 5 lives against a storm of wrong. But now in the stillness he knew better. It wasn't just a rescue. It was a declaration. A tearing away from every wall he'd built to forget the war, the orders, the faces of the men he'd killed when he still thought justice came at the end of a barrel. And now he'd done something dangerous. He'd cared. The old knife glinted in the firelight, the same one Jeremiah had given him when he was 16, with a carved handle shaped like a hawk in flight. For protection, his uncle had said. Or for redemption. That part's up to you. Elias had buried that blade in a box for years, but tonight it had found purpose again, and with it, a question he couldn't shake. Who are you when the past finds your doorstep and asks if you've really changed? Behind him, floorboards creaked. Clarabelle stepped quietly out of the shadows, the dark bruising on her neck now fading into the color of midnight storms. She wore the look of someone who had grown used to silence but not to safety. You still holding that thing like it owes you an answer, she said, nodding toward the knife. Elias didn't look at her. Maybe it does. Clarabelle stepped closer. You had a choice. You could have turned your horse around, pretended you didn't see us. I thought about it, Elias replied, voice low. Then why didn't you? The fire popped. For a long while he didn't speak. Then quietly, because I've run before. Watched good people hang for bad men's sins. Told myself it wasn't my fight. This time, I couldn't. Clarabelle studied him for a long moment. Then, without a word, she sat down beside him, shoulder to shoulder, not touching, but not far. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something neither of them could name yet. Elias turned the knife in his hand and held it out to her handle first. She took it, her fingers brushing his. You sure? She asked. He nodded once. You already saved yourself. This is just the next step. She ran her thumb along the worn engraving on the hilt, then looked at him, eyes fierce but softer now. You didn't just cut us down. You cut yourself free, too. You just don't know it yet. If that moment stirred something in you, a reminder of second chances of standing for what's right, even when it's hard, I hope you'll let us know. Like share or drop a comment. Maybe even tell us. What would you have done holding that knife in the wind? We're all part of this story now. And the storm's just getting started. It wasn't the cabin walls that made her feel trapped. It was the silence after the storm, the lull after survival, when her heart still beat like war drums and her mind whispered, he's still a man. And men in Clarabelle's world had only ever taken. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the floorboards. Clarabelle sat cross-legged near the hearth, the knife Elias had given her still gripped loosely in one hand. She stared at it like it might betray her. Elias had gone outside to chop wood, but every thud of the axe made her flinch. She hated that. Hated how every kind gesture felt like a trap door, just waiting to open beneath her feet. The others, Grace, Ruby, Sadi, Violet. They rested, breathed easier. Even Ruby, whose fury usually boiled over at the first hint of control, had accepted Elias's help with a nod, a thank you, and not a single daggered word. But Clarabelle couldn't. Because she'd been here before. Because kindness always came first, right before the collar. Right before the hand on the back of her neck, pressing her down. She remembered Morrison's voice the day she was taken. You're beautiful when you fight, but you'll be quiet by the end. And for weeks she was. Until the noose, until Elias Ward. And now he'd cut her down, given her his knife, stood between her and fire, but none of that silenced the voice inside her that said, He's still a man. He could still break you. The door creaked. Clarabelle stiffened. Elias stepped inside, arms full of wood. Sweat glistened at his brow, silver-streaked hair curling at his temples. He paused when he saw her awake but said nothing, just moved quietly, placing the logs by the hearth. "You're still holding it," he said after a moment, nodding to the knife. Clarabelle's grip tightened. "Do you want it back?" "No," he said simply. "I gave it to you." Silence. Only the pop of the fire. Then, why? Elias lowered himself to the floor, keeping a respectful distance far enough not to crowd her, close enough she could see his hands were empty. "Because you were still ready to fight, even after what they did. And because the next time someone comes through that door, I want you holding more than rage." Clarabelle looked away. Her voice cracked like old leather. "I don't need saving. I never said you did." He let the words settle, let her breathe. She hated how careful he was, not like a coward, but like someone who understood damage. The kind that didn't bleed where you could see it. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Do you know what it's like to trust a man with your life and have him sell it for a bottle of bourbon?" Elias didn't blink. "Yes." Clarabelle turned toward him, surprised. "My captain left 12 of us to die behind enemy lines. Took the gold, left the wounded. Said it was strategy." He shook his head. "I stopped believing in men that day, including myself." She watched him a long moment. No apology in his voice, no performance. Just truth, blunt and burned down to bone. Clarabelle placed the knife on the floor between them, then slowly pushed it toward him. "If you ever lie to me," she said, voice steady, "I'll take that back." Elias met her eyes. "If I ever lie to you, I won't stop you." Outside, the wind howled against the cabin again, but this time it felt less like a warning and more like a whisper. Trust doesn't return all at once. Sometimes it just sits across the fire, not asking for anything more than to be seen. If you've ever been hurt by someone you trusted and still found a way to believe again, this part of the story is yours too. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from or who you trusted when it felt impossible. And if this story has your heart, tap like or share it with someone who needs it. We're not done yet, not by a long shot. A man doesn't need a gun to be dangerous. Sometimes all he needs is a title, a black robe, and a town too scared to ask questions. Clarabelle sat at the window watching smoke curl from the distant hills, not fire smoke but chimney smoke. Civilization, a town. Somewhere out there, shops opened, bakers rose, early children fetched water, and Morrison walked among them like a man of honor, a judge, a leader, a face they all nodded to because it was safer than asking why women kept disappearing. Behind her, Elias sorted through the stack of documents Violet had tucked beneath the floorboards, papers smeared with blood and truth. Names, land deeds, court seals stamped under false pretense, promises written in ink that turned to chains. Grace stood at the table, arms crossed. "He forged half this town into his own image," she muttered, "and the other half let him." Ruby snorted from where she polished the Colt. Let him, they thanked him. Called him protector. Meanwhile, he sold girls for gold and called it justice. Violet didn't speak. She just watched the fire, her fingers lightly touching the satchel of evidence like it might vanish if she blinked too long. Elias finally spoke. "I fought a war where the enemy wore one color and we wore another. At least then you knew who you were pointing the gun at." Clarabelle turned from the window. "Morrison doesn't need a uniform. His power is silence. He knows the law is just a story, and he's the only one left writing it." That night, over hard bread and stew thick with leftover scraps, they told Elias the full truth. Grace had been a school teacher, beloved, respected, until she spoke out about the missing girls in court records, names that vanished after visiting Morrison's office. She was dragged from her home that night. Her books burned in the street. Ruby had owned the only independent horse trading business in the territory. Morrison offered to partner. When she refused, a sheriff appeared with fabricated debt papers. She lost everything in a single signature she never wrote. Sadi, she was the quiet heartbreak. Her father tried to testify against a mining operation that Morrison had shares in. Days later, their barn went up in flames. The horses gone. Her father found swinging in it. She never spoke to a man again until Elias. Violet's silence wasn't emptiness. It was calculation. She had once been Morrison's clerk, forced to forge names, reassign land, falsify death certificates. She kept copies, hid them, and when he discovered what she had, she disappeared along with his secrets. Clarabelle. She never told the full story, only that she was the one he feared most, the one who got away before he could finish breaking her. Elias leaned back, eyes scanning every face. "And the town they know," Grace said flatly. "They pretend not to," added Violet. "Because Morrison builds the gallows and calls it a courthouse," Ruby spat. Sadi reached across the table, took Clarabelle's hand gently. "They hung us in front of that gate because they thought we were forgotten." Clarabelle's voice was ice and iron. "But we're not." Elias stood slowly, walked to the hearth, and placed Violet's satchel on the mantel like a warning bell. "Then let's remind them. Some wars are fought with bullets, others with memory. And when a man wears the law like armor, the only way to defeat him is to tear off the mask and show the town what's bleeding beneath it. If you've ever felt betrayed by the ones meant to protect you, or found courage in the people who stood beside you anyway, this chapter is for you. Drop a 1 in the comments if this story speaks to you, or a 0 if not. We're just glad you're here, because this tale isn't over. And the next part, well, it's where justice stops whispering and starts kicking down doors. You don't need walls to build a home. But when war is coming, every plank matters. The morning after the truth sat heavy on the table like a dead man's coat, Elias stepped outside and drove the first nail into the cabin's doorframe. Not to mend it, to bar it. "This place was meant for one," he said quietly, "but it'll hold 6 now, or none at all." Inside, the women stirred one by one. There was no talk of running, no suggestion of surrender, just the steady rhythm of preparation like soldiers before the storm. Ruby was the first to move. "I'll take the horses," she said, already pulling on her worn boots. "They'll smell fear before we hear gunfire." She slung a rope over her shoulder, jaw clenched. "If we go down, we won't go down without a chase." Violet took the window ledge, unwrapping her bundle of papers and tucking them beneath floorboards, beneath loose stones in wall cracks sealed with mud. "If Morrison kills us," she said, "he still won't bury the evidence." Not this time. Grace, ever the steady hand, took stock of what little ammunition was left, counted it out like prayer beads. 5 rounds in the musket," she muttered, "and not a one to waste." Her fingers brushed the barrel like she was holding a memory, not a weapon. "I taught children to read. Now I'll teach men what fear sounds like." Sadi remained quiet, but her hands did not. She dragged every table, every chair, every crate to the windows and doors. When Elias tried to help, she shook her head. "Let me do it," she said softly. "Let me fight." And then there was Clarabelle. She stood alone at the hearth, the same rope that had been around her neck now coiled in her hand. She stared at it for a long time before turning and hanging it on a hook by the door. "I won't burn it," she said. "Not yet. Let them see it when they come." Elias looked at her, saw the fire in her eyes, the way her hand gripped the Navy Colt like it belonged there all along. "That gun's heavy," he said. Clarabelle didn't flinch. "So's everything I've carried." By sundown, the cabin no longer looked like a home. It was a fortress. Barred windows, reinforced doors, rifles on the mantel, daggers under pillows. Firewood stacked high, not just for heat, but for barricades. Each woman had chosen her place, her weapon, her reason. And Elias. He stood at the center of it all, not as their protector, but as their equal. No longer a man running from his past, but a man standing for something real. Because this time when Morrison came, he wouldn't find 5 broken women. He'd find 5 loaded barrels, and one man who knew this land was worth dying for. The wind howled across the hills. The night crept closer. And inside the cabin, 6 hearts beat steady, not with fear, but with fire. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about what they chose to become when no one came to save them. Stick around, friend, because what's coming next? It's the part they never write in history books, but the kind you never forget. Some wars start with flags. Others start with torches. This one started with silence. The kind of silence that feels like a breath held too long. The kind that wraps around your throat and whispers, "They're coming." Clarabelle was the first to notice the flicker of fire between the tree line and the ridge. She didn't speak, just moved to the window and placed a single bullet on the sill. Elias saw it too. Dozens of horsemen crawling out of the dark like shadows given teeth. Their torches lit the valley like stars falling from the sky, orange, angry, and closing in fast. "Positions," he said quietly. No panic, no shouting, just boots on wood and weapons in hands. Each woman took the place they'd chosen the day before, not just where they'd fight, but where they'd stand for the lives stolen from them. Ruby kissed the horse she'd raised and let it loose into the hills. "Run," she whispered. "Don't let them catch you." Violet sealed the final floorboard. Sadi whispered a prayer. Grace lit the kerosene lamp and placed it on the table, her fingers trembling but sure. Elias moved to the front door and drew the Winchester, his voice low. "They'll try to talk first. Morrison always does." Clarabelle stood beside him. "Let them waste their breath." The first shout came like thunder. "Ward." "You've made a mistake," Morrison's voice cut through the smoke like a knife in a preacher's hand. "We'll give you one chance, turn them over and walk away." Elias didn't answer. Clarabelle stepped forward, raised the Colt in one hand, and held up the noose in the other. "We're done hanging," she said. "If you want blood, come take it." A beat of silence. Then gunfire. The night exploded. Bullets cracked through the shutters. Flames danced across the porch. The sound of hooves and screams and glass shattering filled the dark. Sadi fired the shotgun, once the blast throwing her backward, but the man who'd breached the side window didn't rise again. Grace struck a match and flung the lamp. The porch ignited. Ruby dove behind the feed barrels and picked them off one by one, each shot, a cry for the sister they took. Violet stabbed a man who kicked the back door open, eyes full of quiet rage, hands steady as stone. And Elias. He moved like smoke and iron. Every shot measured. Every motion like he'd been fighting this war his whole life. Maybe he had. But it was Clarabelle who stood tallest, the Colt blazing in both hands as she stepped out onto the burning porch, hair, wild eyes, feral. Morrison, she screamed into the fire. No answer. Only the night fighting back. By dawn, the smoke began to clear. The field outside was littered with Morrison's riders. Some crawled away, some didn't. And in the doorway of the cabin, the 6 of them stood scorched, bloodied, but unbroken. Because when the land finally fought back, it didn't do it with lawmen or armies. It did it with a cabin full of people who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. If you're still watching, thank you for standing with us. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments, and if your heart's still pounding, you're not alone. Some victories come with cheers. This one came with smoke silence and the sound of boots crunching over ash. By mid-morning, the cabin smelled of blood, gunpowder, and burnt pine. Sadi sat in the corner with a blanket pulled around her shoulders, a streak of soot across her cheek. Violet, ever quiet, pressed torn parchment flat on the table, her fingers moving carefully, like every crease could cost them everything. Outside, Elias buried the last man who hadn't crawled away. He didn't say a prayer, just stood a moment, eyes on the scorched valley below, and then turned back toward the cabin. The war had taken its swing, but the truth that still had to be told. Inside, Violet unrolled the last map. Black ink scrawled across faded lines, Cherokee land marked with X's. Mining claims, fake debt transfers, forged court seals. She didn't need to explain it. The weight of it filled the room like a second fire. Clarabelle, bruised and still holding her Colt like it was part of her body, spoke first. "We ride to the town." Grace raised an eyebrow. "And say what? That 5 women crawled back from the noose and burned a militia to the ground," No, Violet said quietly. "We say the judge forged documents, sold land, bought silence, and turned law into a weapon." She held up the silver pendant next a delicate oval locket. Inside, a portrait of a woman in a green dress and a note in a hand so small and tight it could only belong to someone writing in fear. Margaret Morrison. Her face stared back at them, ghost-like but real. "She's alive," Violet said. "He faked her death, stole her family's land, and silenced her." Grace took the locket in her hand and passed it to Elias. He opened it slowly, thumb brushing the edge. "I know a marshal in Denver," he said. "The kind that still believes in oaths. We take this, we take the papers, and we tell the world." Clarabelle stepped closer, her face still swollen along the rope mark on her cheek. "Do you trust him?" "No," Elias replied. "But I trust what's right." That night, while the others rested, Elias sat by the fire, sifting through the documents again. Violet joined him. She didn't speak, not for a long while, just handed him a folded note she hadn't shown the others. It was Clarabelle's death certificate, signed by Morrison himself, dated a week before Elias had cut her from the rope. He read it, folded it, and set it in the fire. Violet didn't flinch. "He buried us on paper," she whispered. "But we're still standing." Elias nodded. "And that's what scares him most." The fire flared as the paper curled to ash. Behind them, the cabin was quiet, full of breath and bruises, but also something stronger: resolve. Some men try to write history with ink. Others try with fire. But sometimes it's the broken hands, the ones that shook signing a name or gripped a locket to stay sane, that carry the truth farther than any bullet ever could. If you've followed this story this far, thank you. Like, comment, or share it with someone who believes in second chances. Let me know below, who are you standing beside tonight? Some gates are meant to keep things out. But this one was about letting something in hope. 3 days after the smoke settled, Elias stood where the old gate once hung, a hammer in one hand, a board balanced across his shoulder. The rope that Morrison's men had used still lay in the dirt, frayed and blackened at the ends. He didn't burn it. He buried it. Clarabelle helped steady the post, her green eyes softer now, though the fire still lived beneath. Sadi carried nails in a tin pail. Ruby drove them in without flinching. Violet measured angles with steady hands, while Grace called out instructions in a voice that made everyone move a little faster. They weren't building for protection anymore. They were building to belong. Each board carried more than wood. It carried story, scar, memory. And as the new gate rose beneath the Wyoming sky, it didn't just stand tall, it stood different, open wide. Not a warning, but a welcome. Later that evening, Elias rested on the porch, watching the sun spill gold across the valley. Clarabelle handed him a tin cup of coffee, her fingers brushing his. He looked at her, then the others, and said, "This was never just a cabin." She nodded once. "No," she whispered. "It's a beginning. The West doesn't forget. It remembers every boot that crushed its dirt, every scream lost in the wind, every grave with no name. But once in a while, not often, not easy, it forgives. And only the brave get to earn it." The cabin stood quiet now under a bruised sky. Smoke from the chimney curled slow like a breath finally released after too many held too long. Inside, Sadi strummed a soft tune on a battered fiddle. Ruby told a joke that made Grace shake her head. Violet scribbled in her ledger, the firelight flickering across her page. And Clarabelle leaned against the frame of the open door, arms folded, watching Elias fix the last hinge on the gate. "You still think you only inherited a cabin?" she asked, voice teasing, but tired in a way only the truth can be. Elias looked up, eyes silver like old storms finally passing. "No," he said. "I inherited a reason. Out here on the edge of law and dust, it's not blood that makes a family. It's who stands beside you when the world burns. And maybe that's why this story stays with us. Because deep down, we all hope we'd be the kind of person who cuts the rope, who rebuilds the gate, who stays. So tell me this, if you'd been Elias standing at that tree, would you have drawn the knife? Type yes, if you would have. Type no, if you're still thinking about it. Or better yet, tell me why. And if this story held your heart, don't let it be the last. Subscribe for more Wild West tales where courage doesn't ride alone. We'll be waiting at the next sunset.